A kind male supermarket cashier paid for the groceries of an old lady who forgot her wallet, not knowing that she was a millionaire. She promised to repay the favor him, but not long after, he suddenly had to quit his job because the city still belonged to the night. The streets were quiet, the air crisp, with the lingering chill of dawn. A single street lamp flickered outside the worn apartment complex, casting a dim glow against the cracked pavement. Inside, the faint hum of a kettle whistling on the stove was the only sound breaking the silence. Kyle stood by the counter, carefully pouring hot water into a mug. The steam curled into the air, mixing with the faint scent of chamomile and lemon balm, the tea his grandmother liked. He set the cup down beside a neatly folded napkin and a small handwritten note. "Drink this while it's warm. Love, Kyle." The apartment was small, but it was clean. Everything had a place, not because there was much, but because clutter made the space feel smaller than it already was. He cast a glance toward the couch, where Susan lay curled under a thick quilt, her breathing slow and steady. Her once strong hands now rested motionless on her chest, the veins beneath her skin prominent, fragile. Kyle adjusted the blanket one last time before grabbing his worn-out backpack and slipping on his jacket. The zipper stuck halfway up, like it always did. He didn't bother fixing it. He had a bus to catch. The sky still clung to the last traces of night when Kyle stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting through his thin jacket. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting an amber glow on the empty sidewalks. The city was waking in slow murmurs, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shuffle of footsteps from early risers, the rhythmic dripping of condensation from a rooftop gutter. Near the supermarket's loading dock, a small shadow darted between the crates. A stray cat, patchy fur, wary green eyes. Kyle crouched down, pulling a small piece of bread from his pocket. "Here you go, buddy," he murmured, setting it down. "Breakfast's on me today." The cat hesitated before inching closer, sniffing cautiously before taking a careful bite. Kyle watched for a moment, then straightened, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He adjusted his worn-out jacket and started his shift. Inside the supermarket, the world moved in routines. The beeping of scanners, the rustle of plastic bags, the soft murmur of idle conversation. Kyle worked efficiently, stacking cans onto shelves, sweeping stray crumbs from the bakery section, loading fresh produce into the displays. "You ever take a break, man?" A co-worker, Jason, teased as he walked past, tossing an orange in the air. Kyle smirked. "Haven't figured out how yet." Jason chuckled. "You should try it sometime. Might even like it." Kyle only shook his head, but the tiredness in his limbs was undeniable. 2 jobs, day after day. The supermarket in the morning, security shifts at a construction site at night. Sleep was a luxury he had learned to stretch thin, just like his paycheck. Yet, he never complained. Complaining didn't change the price of rent, didn't put food on the table, didn't ease the ache in Susan's bones. He kept moving. By noon, the store had settled into its usual rhythm, the steady flow of customers, the occasional burst of laughter from the checkout lanes, the mechanical hum of the refrigerators. Kyle was organizing the flower section when he noticed them, an elderly couple. The woman, small-framed but with sharp, knowing eyes, was nudging her husband aside, determined to lift a heavy bag of flour into their cart. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edges. "I can do it," she said, voice firm but betraying the struggle beneath. Her husband, taller and a bit broader, hesitated. "Sharon, just let me—" "I've got it, Lawrence," she insisted, but the weight was proving otherwise. Kyle stepped forward before she could argue further. "Here, let me help," he said, lifting the bag effortlessly and placing it into their cart. Sharon paused, looking up at him. Her eyes, piercing but not unkind, studied him for a beat longer than necessary, as if assessing something beyond his words. Lawrence exhaled, a soft chuckle escaping. "Well, that saves me an argument." Kyle smiled, dusting the flour from his hands. "No problem. Anything else you need?" Sharon didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Lawrence, then back at Kyle. "Not today," she said eventually, but the curiosity in her gaze lingered even as Kyle nodded and turned back to his work. As he walked away, he could still feel her eyes on him. That evening, as Kyle closed up his shift, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. The sun had dipped beyond the horizon, the sky now a deep indigo. He rolled his shoulders, already dreading the long night ahead at the construction site. But as he passed the loading dock, he paused. The cat was still there, perched on a crate, licking its paws. It looked up, blinking lazily at him. Kyle reached into his pocket and pulled out the last bite of his sandwich from lunch. He broke it in half, placing one piece on the ground. "Looks like we're both working overtime," he muttered. The cat sniffed the bread, then took a small bite. Kyle smiled. Some things, at least, didn't change. With that, he stuffed his hands into his pockets and started walking toward his second shift. Another long night, another battle with exhaustion. But another day he had made it through. And tomorrow, he'd do it all over again. A cold drizzle had settled over the city, the kind that seeped into bones and made even warm hands feel numb. The supermarket's sliding doors parted with a quiet hiss, letting in a gust of damp wind, along with a solitary figure. Sharon stepped inside, her coat still speckled with raindrops. She pulled the scarf tighter around her neck, shaking off the chill. The store was busier than before. Shoppers maneuvered their carts through crowded aisles, muffled chatter blending with the steady beep of registers. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and disinfectant, a familiar but oddly sterile comfort. She moved with purpose, selecting only what was necessary: bread, milk, a few cans of soup. Each item landed softly in her basket, but her mind was elsewhere. Her fingers traced the rim of a soup can, absent-mindedly, before she placed it in her cart. Lawrence had insisted on coming with her, but she had waved him off. She didn't need help. At least, that's what she told herself. Her body disagreed. Her hands, once steady and sure, trembled slightly as she pushed the cart forward. She ignored it. The checkout lanes stretched before her, each one humming with movement. Sharon chose the shortest one, rolling her cart into place. Kyle stood at the register, scanning a customer's items with quiet efficiency. His face was the same as before, calm, focused, the kind of patience that came from understanding struggle. Sharon smiled faintly, adjusting the bag on her shoulder. The line moved forward, one step, then another, and then it was her turn. Kyle nodded in greeting, reaching for her items: the bread, the milk, the cans. Each one met the scanner with a soft beep. Then came the moment of payment. Sharon reached into her coat pocket, then another. Her fingers brushed nothing but fabric. Her stomach dropped. She patted down the other side, feeling only loose threads. A small frown creased her forehead. Her breath hitched slightly as she checked the small compartment inside her purse. Empty. For a brief second, the sounds of the supermarket faded. Her ears rang, her chest tightened. Not from fear, not from panic, but something quieter, something colder. A different kind of weight settled over her, one she knew well, but never welcomed. Not again. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I must have left my wallet at home," she murmured, her voice quieter than she intended. Kyle's hands stilled. The customer behind her shifted impatiently. Someone in another line let out an annoyed sigh. Sharon forced a small smile, though it felt fragile. "I'll put some things back," she said, reaching for the cans. "I don't want to—" A sharp voice cut in. "Step aside. We'll handle it later." Samantha. The manager stood at the end of the lane, arms crossed, expression neutral but edged with irritation. Sharon blinked. Handle it? Like a misplaced item on a shelf. There was no malice in Samantha's tone, no outright cruelty. But there was something worse. Indifference. Sharon nodded stiffly, stepping back. Her hands gripped the cart's handle a little too tightly as she moved to the side, her body suddenly feeling much smaller in the bustling store. She sat down on the small bench near customer service, resting her hands on her lap. The sounds of the store carried on, but she felt apart from them now, like watching a scene from a distance, unable to step back into it. She had faced worse, much worse, but still, a small bitter thought pressed against her ribs. I used to be someone who never had to check. She inhaled deeply, pressing her fingers together, willing the feeling away. Minutes passed. Then, "Madam?" She looked up. Kyle stood in front of her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the receipt. She opened her mouth, but he shook his head slightly before she could protest. "It's covered," he said simply, holding out the bag. Sharon stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't move. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was something else. Not pity, not an obligation, just kindness. Her throat tightened. "You didn't have to do that," she finally managed, though her voice was softer than before. Kyle gave a small shrug. "It's just groceries." But they both knew it wasn't. Sharon took the bag, fingers curling around the paper handles. A pause. She swallowed. "You're a good boy." Kyle gave a small smile, before stepping back behind the counter, already moving on to the next customer. Sharon sat there a moment longer, looking down at the bag in her lap. The weight in her chest felt a little lighter. She stood, adjusted her scarf, and walked out into the rain. This time the cold didn't bite quite as much. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm outside, tapping against the supermarket windows like impatient fingers. The hum of customers had begun to dwindle, replaced by the mechanical whir of receipt printers and the occasional murmur of late shoppers discussing last-minute purchases. Kyle exhaled, watching as Sharon disappeared into the misty evening, her silhouette swallowed by the cold drizzle. The paper bag she carried looked too heavy for someone her age, but she had straightened her shoulders before stepping outside, refusing to let the weight show. He turned back to his register, but before he could settle into routine, a sharp voice cut through the low hum of the store. "Must be nice to throw money around." Kyle closed his eyes briefly before turning. Samantha stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her mouth twisted into something between amusement and condescension. Her carefully pressed blouse was still pristine, despite the long shift, and her eyes gleamed with something close to smugness. "Feeling like a hero?" she added, tilting her head. Kyle's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the counter, but his face remained neutral. He had spent enough years swallowing down frustration to know that reacting only gave people like Samantha more power than they deserved. "She needed help," he said, voice steady. Samantha let out a soft scoff, shaking her head. "And what about tomorrow? You gonna start a charity right here in aisle 5? Maybe set up a donation box for every sad old lady who forgets her wallet?" Kyle didn't rise to the bait. He simply held her gaze, calm and unbothered. For a brief moment, something flickered in her expression. Annoyance at his lack of response, maybe even disappointment that he hadn't given her an argument to twist. She sighed dramatically. "Suit yourself." Then she turned and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the tile, the final note of an interaction she had clearly decided wasn't worth her time. Kyle exhaled, rolling his shoulders back before turning to his next customer. but he could feel the lingering attention of his co-workers, and, as expected, the whispers followed. "So, are you adopting a new grandma now? Maybe she'll put you in her will." A quiet chuckle rippled between them, but Kyle didn't flinch. He focused on his work, bagging groceries, scanning items, keeping his hands busy. He had learned a long time ago that kindness didn't need an explanation, especially not for people who measured everything in gains and losses. By the time Kyle finished his shift, the night had settled deep, and the rain had thickened into a misty veil. The streets glistened under the streetlights, puddles reflecting the dim yellow glow. He walked with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. The city smelled of damp pavement and the faint, lingering scent of roasted peanuts from a street vendor who had packed up for the night. The familiar creak of the apartment door greeted him as he stepped inside. The air inside was warmer, carrying the faint scent of peppermint tea and the soft rustle of blankets as Susan shifted in her chair by the window. She looked up, her sharp but tired eyes studying him. "You're late tonight." Kyle shrugged off his damp jacket, hanging it near the door. "Got caught up at work." Susan gestured to the kettle on the stove. "Tea's still warm if you want some." He nodded, pouring himself a cup before settling into the worn-out chair across from her. The steam curled up toward his face, offering a brief moment of comfort. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the occasional sound of passing cars filling the quiet spaces. Susan finally tilted her head, her gaze knowing. Something happened. Kyle took a slow sip before setting the cup down. "Just a customer forgot her wallet." Susan's brow lifted slightly. Kyle leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "I covered it." There was no judgment in Susan's expression, only patience. Kyle hesitated before continuing. It wasn't much, just some groceries, but the way she looked... He paused, staring down at the tea in his hands, as if searching for the right words. "It reminded me of you." Susan's fingers stilled around her teacup. Kyle sighed. "I kept thinking, if it were you standing there, what would I have wanted someone to do?" A long silence stretched between them. Then Susan reached out, her frail, wrinkled hand resting over his. The warmth of her touch was light, but steady. "You have a good heart, Kyle," she murmured. There was something in her eyes, pride, sadness, something deeper that words couldn't quite capture. Kyle gave her hand a small squeeze before pulling away, reaching for his tea again. He wouldn't tell her about Samantha. He wouldn't tell her about the laughter at his expense, about the exhaustion that pressed into his ribs, or the quiet frustration of working so hard for so little. Because in the end, none of that mattered. What mattered was that tonight, somewhere across the city, an elderly woman wasn't sitting alone, wondering if she had to return her groceries, and that was enough. The city never truly slept, but at this hour, it dozed lightly, streetlights flickering over deserted sidewalks, the occasional car humming past, a distant siren wailing before fading into the night. Kyle leaned against the metal security booth at the construction site, his breath visible in the crisp air. His eyelids felt heavy, and he fought the creeping exhaustion that always settled in around this time, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the world seemed unnervingly still. He blinked hard, shaking his head to clear the fog. The long shifts were wearing on him, but there was no room for self-pity. He needed both jobs. The supermarket barely covered rent and groceries, and the night shifts at the construction site filled in the gaps. He could endure being tired. He had to. Still, some nights, when the cold air pressed against his skin and his body ached for sleep, he wondered how much longer he could keep up this rhythm. The following morning at the supermarket, The air buzzed with idle chatter. People are talking about rent, living expenses, children's education, or parents' support. It's normal in a place where adults need to learn to endure, to make a living, and be ready to face everything. But lately, there was a new hum beneath it all. Whispers that curled around the aisles like stray drafts, gossip slipping between price tags and half-stocked shelves. Samantha had seen to that. "St. Kyle at it again," she'd remark when he passed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "If you ever need a loan, just ask Kyle. I'm sure he's got plenty to spare," she quipped one afternoon, smirking as she flipped through inventory reports. At first, it had just been her, but soon others picked up on it, laughing behind their hands, dropping comments in passing. "Hey, Kyle, how much for you to cover my groceries next time? Charity work paying off yet?" Kyle never responded. He just kept his head down and worked. The morning that everything changed, Samantha was particularly sharp-edged. The store had received an internal memo the night before. A high-level inspection team would be arriving today. Management visits were rare. The last time corporate had sent someone, it had been a regional supervisor who barely glanced at the employees. This time, however, there was no name listed, only a directive. Ensure everything is in perfect order. Samantha took that as a personal mission. By noon, she was barking orders like a drill sergeant. "Come on, people," she barked, clapping her hands together loudly enough that a few employees flinched. "We have high-level executives coming in. That means this store needs to look flawless. No slacking, no mess, and if I catch anyone standing around—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the look she gave was enough. Kyle exchanged glances with another employee, a young woman stacking produce nearby. She rolled her eyes subtly, muttering under her breath, "She's only good at making things look perfect on the outside." Kyle didn't disagree. Samantha had always been more concerned with appearances than actual work. And now, with the promise of important visitors, she was more unbearable than usual. Rumors had already started circling. Some said it was a routine inspection. Others whispered that it was a make-or-break moment, that the future of this particular store rested on whether or not the executives were impressed. Kyle wasn't sure what to believe. All he knew was that Samantha's orders were coming faster than usual, her temper shorter. The air in the store shifted when the black car pulled up outside. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, letting in the crisp afternoon air as the vehicle came to a slow stop. Employees instinctively straightened their uniforms, their chatter fading into hushed murmurs. Samantha's demeanor transformed in an instant. She smoothed the front of her blouse, checking her reflection in the nearest glass panel. The sharp, commanding edge in her voice disappeared, replaced by a practiced sweetness, as she positioned herself near the entrance, waiting. Then the doors opened. Sharon stepped out first, followed by Lawrence. Their presence wasn't loud or commanding, but there was something about the way they carried themselves, calm, measured, utterly self-assured, that made even the most disinterested employees pause. Kyle, still stationed at his register, felt his pulse slow. He had no idea why they were here. But as Sharon's sharp eyes scanned the store, lingering for just a second too long on him, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another visit, and whatever was coming next, it was about to change everything. The atmosphere in the store shifted the moment Sharon and Lawrence stepped inside. The hum of idle conversations faded, the beeping of registers felt distant, and the weight of their presence settled over the employees like an invisible current. Kyle, standing behind his register, felt his fingers tighten slightly around the scanner. His heartbeat slowed, heavy and deliberate, as he watched Sharon's sharp eyes sweep across the store. Something about the way she moved, with quiet authority, with purpose, made it clear that she wasn't here as a customer. She was here as something else. Someone else. Samantha was the first to react. The transformation in her demeanor was almost comical. Her usual sharpness softened into something saccharine. Her shoulders straightened, and the edge of her voice turned warm and rehearsed. She strode forward with a practiced smile, exuding the kind of artificial charm reserved for moments of self-preservation. "Mrs. Harrington." Her voice was bright, overly saccharine, the kind of sweetness that felt artificial the moment it left her lips. "What an honor." Sharon walked right past her. The dismissal was so effortless, so smooth, that it took Samantha a full second to register it. The smile on her face faltered for just a fraction of a moment, a barely perceptible flicker of embarrassment. Kyle swallowed hard as Sharon moved toward him, her steps measured, deliberate. Lawrence followed, his hand slipping into his suit pocket. In one fluid motion, he pulled out a crisp envelope and extended it toward Kyle. "This is for what you spent the other day," Lawrence said, his voice even, free of condescension or unnecessary gratitude. Kyle hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had never expected repayment. That wasn't why he had done it. His fingers hovered before finally taking the envelope, though he didn't glance inside. Instead, he tucked it into his pocket, unsure of what else to do. The store had gone quiet. Not completely. There was still the hum of background noise, the distant beeping of registers, the soft shuffle of carts, but within the circle of employees and customers watching, there was an undeniable silence. Then, Sharon turned. She didn't address Kyle this time. She addressed everyone. "This young man helped me twice," she said, her voice carrying through the store, smooth and unwavering. "And he didn't do it for a reward." The words cut through the air like a knife. Samantha stiffened beside them. Kyle barely dared to breathe. He didn't like being the center of attention, but he could feel the weight of every gaze on him. Sharon's expression remained calm, but there was an edge to her voice now. "I built this company on kindness," she continued, her tone shifting, gaining an almost imperceptible sharpness. "But some people seem to have forgotten that." Samantha's entire body tensed. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. A ripple of murmurs spread through the employees. Subtle, but unmistakable. Samantha's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to interject, but she hesitated. Sharon finally turned her full attention back to her, and there was no warmth left in her gaze. "Pack your things," she said, her voice like cold steel. "You're done here." A collective inhale swept through the store. For the first time since anyone could remember, Samantha looked rattled. Her carefully maintained composure cracked at the edges, disbelief flashing across her face before she masked it with indignation. "Excuse me?" She let out a sharp, humorless laugh, but there was a tremor beneath it. "You can't just—" "I can," Sharon interrupted smoothly. "And I am." Lawrence remained silent, his presence beside his wife only reinforcing her words. Kyle watched as Samantha's confidence wavered. She glanced around as if searching for support, but the store had turned against her in an instant. The employees who had once tiptoed around her, who had once lowered their heads to avoid her sharp remarks, stood watching with a quiet kind of satisfaction. Samantha's jaw tightened. Her pride wouldn't allow her to beg. Instead, she let out a scoff, rolling her eyes. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath before turning on her heel and storming toward the back office. The moment she disappeared, a strange sort of stillness settled over the store. No one quite knew what to say. Some employees exchanged uncertain glances. Others let out small, barely audible exhales of relief. A few customers, oblivious to the deeper context, simply went back to their shopping. Kyle remained where he was, still gripping the envelope in his pocket. Sharon turned back to him, her expression softening. "You should take a break," she said, and though it wasn't a suggestion, her voice was kinder now. I'm sure you could use one. Kyle hesitated, then nodded. He didn't know what had just happened, didn't fully understand why it had played out the way it had, but what he did know, deep in his chest, was that something had shifted, and there was no going back. Kyle's hands were still cold. He wasn't sure if it was from the air conditioning, the adrenaline, or the sheer weight of what had just happened. Samantha was gone, just like that. And now, Sharon was looking at him, but instead of stepping away, instead of letting the moment pass, he found himself speaking. "Ma'am, I'm just—" Sharon raised a hand, silencing him before he could protest. "You're our new store manager." Kyle blinked. For a second, he thought he'd misheard her. The words didn't quite make sense in his exhausted brain. The words didn't belong to him. Him, the store manager? The title felt foreign, out of place, as if it had been carelessly dropped into the conversation by mistake. His stomach tightened. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be standing in Samantha's place. "Wait." Kyle's voice came out more rushed than he intended. "That doesn't make sense. I mean, I appreciate it, but I don't think—" Sharon's expression didn't change. "You think you can't do it?" Kyle swallowed. It wasn't that. Or maybe it was. Maybe he didn't want the responsibility. Maybe he didn't think he deserved it. Maybe he was just a guy trying to make it through the month, through the year, through life, without collapsing from exhaustion. Maybe he was afraid. Let us know what the weather was like, where you were when this story was sent to you, in the comments below. But Sharon didn't see that. Or if she did, she ignored it. "You've already shown more leadership than most," she said, her tone as matter-of-fact as ever. Kyle hesitated, trying to gather his thoughts, but the weight of her certainty pressed against his ribs. What did leadership even mean? Helping people, doing the right thing when no one else would. Because if that was it, if that was all it took, then maybe he had been doing it all along. The supermarket had returned to its usual rhythm. Customers shuffled through the aisles, carts rattling against the tile, the steady beeping of registers filling the space once more. Conversations drifted between shelves, murmurs of weekend plans, dinner ideas, and impatient sighs from those waiting in line. It was as if nothing had happened. But Kyle was still sitting there, hands resting on the counter, his heartbeat steady, but loud in his ears. His fingers brushed over the smooth card Sharon had handed him, the weight of it unnatural in his palm. Store manager. He let the words settle in his mind, but they didn't fit. They didn't belong to him. He had never thought beyond tomorrow, never thought beyond the next shift, the next paycheck, the next time he had to decide between paying the electric bill early or stretching groceries for an extra week. And now, just like that, he was supposed to be someone else. He was supposed to be in charge. He felt a presence before he saw them. Jason, one of the employees from the stocking crew, leaned on the counter, studying him. "Are you good?" Kyle blinked. "Was he?" He cleared his throat. "Yeah, I think so." Jason smirked, tossing a bag of candy onto the counter. "You don't look it." Kyle exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He was still in his cashier uniform. He still had another shift at the construction site tonight. And yet, suddenly, he was supposed to be standing where Samantha had been just minutes ago, giving orders instead of taking them. The absurdity of it made his stomach tighten. Jason popped open the bag of candy and plucked out a piece. "So, you're really the new boss, huh?" Kyle glanced down at the card again. The proof was right there, but it still didn't feel real. "Looks like it." Jason let out a low whistle. "Man, that's wild. You were just here scanning milk like an hour ago." Kyle huffed a quiet laugh. "Still am. But was he? Would he ever be just that again? A few other employees were watching from a distance, pretending to work, but clearly curious. The store had always operated under an unspoken rule. Keep your head down, don't make waves, don't expect change. And yet, here it was. Change. Jason leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Not going to lie, dude. Most of us, we're kind of glad Samantha's gone. Kyle raised a brow. Jason shrugged. She was all about looking good when corporate came around, but she didn't care about anyone working here. You? He paused, chewing on the words. You're different. Kyle let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Different. Was that enough? He had no management experience, no training, no clue how to run a store. He barely had time to sleep between shifts, let alone take on more responsibility. And yet, Sharon had looked at him like she already knew he could do it, like it wasn't a question. Kyle stared at the business card again, the gold lettering catching the light. If you need anything, Sharon had said. But what did that mean? What did he need? For years, the answer had always been simple. Money. Stability. Enough to keep Susan safe, enough to get through another month. But now, he wasn't sure. The shift supervisor, Maria, appeared beside Jason, clipboard in hand. Hey, Kyle, she said, offering a small but knowing smile. Looks like things are changing around here. Kyle let out a breath, finally standing. His legs felt heavier than before. Yeah, he admitted. Guess they are. Maria glanced at the schedule posted by the break room door. So, what now? What now? Kyle wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long time, he had the choice to decide. The air inside the supermarket hadn't changed. Fluorescent lights still flickered slightly in aisle 6. The faint scent of coffee and cardboard lingered near the break room, and the steady beep of registers filled the silence between conversations. But everything felt different. Kyle stood in the office, staring at the schedule taped to the wall. His name was at the top now, printed neatly under the words Store Manager. It still didn't feel real. The first few days were a blur, managing schedules, handling supply orders, making sure the night crew stocked shelves correctly. It all came at him fast. The first time Maria handed him an inventory report, his mind blanked for a moment before he forced himself to focus. Just numbers, he muttered under his breath, scanning the list. Numbers I need to make sense of. His co-workers, once comfortable enough to joke with him, watched him differently now. It wasn't fear or resentment, but something closer to cautious respect, as if they weren't sure how much of Kyle was still Kyle. Jason grinned when Kyle helped him restock a shipment of rice bags, rolling up his sleeves like nothing had changed. Hate to break it to you, boss, but managers don't usually lift stuff themselves. Kyle smirked, wiping dust off his hands. Guess I'm not doing this right then. Maria, watching nearby, only nodded approvingly. Bit by bit, the unease faded. Back home, Susan noticed the change in him before he did. Your shoulders don't look so heavy, she commented one night as he helped her settle into bed. Kyle scoffed lightly, fluffing her pillow. I don't know about that. But she gave him that look, the one that always made him pause, like she could see straight through him. You look more like yourself, she murmured, patting his hand. Kyle didn't answer. Not because he didn't believe her, but because he wasn't sure who that was anymore. Weeks passed. Kyle quit his job at the construction site after earning a high salary as a supermarket manager. Susan's health had improved, little by little. She walked more now, even if it was just around the apartment, and the exhaustion in her face had softened. Kyle came home earlier than usual one evening, his first real night off in months. The sound of soft humming drifted from the kitchen, the kind that only happened when Susan was in a good mood. When he stepped inside, she was at the counter, stirring something in a mixing bowl. He raised a brow. "You're up to something." She smiled, but didn't look up. "Making pumpkin bread." Kyle blinked. Pumpkin bread. The smell alone sent him straight back to childhood, afternoons spent at the kitchen table, the warmth of the oven filling their tiny home, the way Susan always saved the edges for him because he liked them crispy. He swallowed. "You shouldn't be on your feet too long," he said, softer this time. Susan waved him off, placing the dough into a pan. "I'm feeling better. Besides, I had a thought." Kyle leaned against the counter, watching her. "Oh." She wiped her hands on a dish towel. Then, casually, like it wasn't about to flip his evening upside down, she said, "We should visit Sharon." For a moment, Kyle said nothing. The idea felt too personal, too much like stepping into something that wasn't meant for him. But Susan's expression was unwavering. "I wouldn't be here if not for her," she added, "and neither would you." Kyle exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. She wasn't wrong. Still, something about it unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him realize he was standing at the edge of something bigger than himself. He pulled out his wallet, thumbing through the cash he had. "I'll get some flowers," he said finally. Susan smiled knowingly before turning back to her bread. That night, as the pumpkin bread cooled on the counter, Kyle sat by the window, staring at the city outside. He still wasn't sure if he was doing this right, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was moving forward, and tomorrow, he'd knock on Sharon's door. The drive was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way. The kind of silence that was filled with unspoken thoughts, heavy, yet peaceful. Kyle kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. The flowers lay on the seat beside him, their petals delicate, slightly shifting with every turn. Susan sat in the passenger seat, cradling the loaf of pumpkin bread wrapped in a dish towel like it was something sacred. Kyle finally exhaled, glancing at her. "This still feels weird," he muttered. Susan's lips curled into a knowing smile. "That's because you're overthinking it." Kyle huffed, shaking his head. "I don't overthink." Susan chuckled, resting her hands over the warm bread. "Of course you don't." But she didn't push further, and Kyle appreciated that. When they pulled up in front of Sharon's house, Kyle took a second just to take it in. It was exactly what he expected. Spacious but inviting. A house with history in its walls, warmth in its foundation. A wooden bench swing swayed gently on the porch, moved by the light evening breeze. The scent of lavender hung in the air, drifting from the garden, wrapping the space in something almost nostalgic. Kyle grabbed the flowers, stepping around to help Susan out of the car. She wasn't as fragile as she had been months ago, but he still watched her carefully as she straightened herself. For a moment, she stood there, taking in the house. Something unreadable flickered across her face. Then, she nodded, as if making a decision only she understood. "Let's go," she said softly. The doorbell chime was soft but clear, carrying through the stillness inside. A pause. Then, footsteps, measured, steady, and familiar. The door opened. Sharon stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes landing on Kyle first, the way they always did, assessing, calculating, always a step ahead. But then, she looked past him and froze. For a long, stretched-out moment, nothing happened. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time had pulled back, waiting. Susan took a single step forward, her fingers tightening slightly around the dish towel. The tension broke. Sharon's breath hitched, Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that Kyle saw the way her chest rose, the way her fingers trembled slightly before reaching for the doorframe. And then, barely above a whisper, as if saying the name might make the moment slip away. Susie. Susan exhaled. It sounded like a laugh, but it was wet with something deeper. Sharon? The years collapsed in an instant. Sharon stepped forward, then stumbled, not from weakness, but from shock, from disbelief so tangible that it made her body move before her mind could catch up. And then they embraced. Not a polite hug, not a soft reunion. It was fierce, tight, unrelenting, the kind of embrace that came from 4 decades of silence. Susan's face pressed into Sharon's shoulder, her frail fingers clutching at the fabric of her blouse, as if she was afraid it might all disappear. Kyle swallowed hard, looking away for a second. He had never seen Susan cry before, not when his grandfather passed, not through the hardest nights of their struggles, not when she had been sick. But now, silent tears slipped down her cheeks, soaking into Sharon's shoulder, and Sharon, always composed, always in control, was crying too. One of her hands cupped the back of Susan's head, the other gripping her arm, as if she needed proof that she was really there. "I thought I lost you," Sharon whispered. Susan laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "You did. And I lost you too." Sharon pulled back, just enough to see her properly, to drink in the face of the friend she had thought was gone forever. Her hand lifted, brushing over the faintest scar on Susan's cheek. One Kyle had never thought twice about, but now he saw Sharon's fingers hesitate there, like it was a piece of history only she remembered. "How?" Sharon started, but her voice broke, so she just shook her head. Susan smiled, watery, but full of warmth. Long story. Sharon exhaled sharply, half laughing, half sobbing. Then she turned to Kyle, as if truly seeing him for the first time. She studied him, the way he stood there, the way he had been watching quietly, taking in everything. And then, a realization. "You never told me your grandmother was Susie." Kyle blinked. "Didn't know I needed to." Sharon let out a full, rich laugh, shaking her head. She reached out then, gripping his arm, not in a businesslike handshake, not in a polite gesture, but something firm, something full of meaning. "Well," she said, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes still glistening. "I guess that means your family." The night stretched on as the 4 of them sat in Sharon and Lawrence's warm, spacious living room, the scent of lavender and old books mixing with the fading aroma of Susan's pumpkin bread. The initial shock of the reunion had settled, replaced by something quieter, something deeper, the warmth of old memories being unearthed, dusted off and shared as if they had never been forgotten. Sharon sat close to Susan, their hands occasionally brushing as they spoke, as if neither quite believed the other was real. "I can't believe it's really you," Sharon murmured, for the 3rd time, shaking her head. "All this time." "You left town so suddenly," Susan murmured, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "One day, we were planning our futures, and the next, you were gone." Sharon sighed, shaking her head. "Lawrence got an opportunity in the city, and back then, you didn't say no to opportunities. We barely had a phone, let alone an address book. I thought I'd come back sooner, thought I'd find a way to write, but..." She exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Time moves faster than you think." Susan smiled sadly. "I used to wonder if you ever looked back." Sharon's fingers tightened around her teacup. "I did. I always did." Kyle watched them, quietly taking it all in. He had never heard Susan speak about her past with such wistfulness, such lingering ache. For as long as he had known her, she had always been focused on the present, on survival. But now, sitting beside Sharon, it was like he was seeing a different side of her. The version of his grandmother that had existed before life had gotten hard. Lawrence, who had been watching the conversation unfold, finally spoke. "Kyle," he said, leaning forward, his voice calm but purposeful. "You've been managing the store for a few weeks now. How's it been?" Kyle straightened slightly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's different." He let out a small, thoughtful chuckle. "I'm still figuring things out." Lawrence smirked. "That's the thing about leadership. You're always figuring things out." Kyle nodded, but the weight of the statement sat heavy on his chest. Sharon tilted her head, studying him. "Have you thought about what's next?" Kyle frowned. "Next?" Sharon leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Yes. You're smart, Kyle. You work hard. But is this it? Do you want this to be your ceiling?" Kyle's stomach tightened slightly. He had spent so long just trying to keep things together, so long focused on what was right in front of him, that the thought of planning for something bigger felt almost ridiculous. Sharon exchanged a look with Lawrence before he leaned forward, his expression serious. "What if you went back to school?" The words hit Kyle like a slow-moving wave, one that took a moment to fully register before it crashed into him. Kyle blinked. "What?" Lawrence nodded, his expression calm, unwavering. "You didn't finish, right?" Kyle hesitated, then shook his head. Number I dropped out. A deep, heavy silence settled in the room. Then, Susan lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around the tea in her lap. Kyle felt the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders curled inward just slightly, as if folding into herself. And then she spoke, so soft, almost hesitant. "I failed," she murmured. "Kyle had to drop out because of me." The weight of her words settled over the room, pressing down on them like an invisible force. Sharon reached for Susan's hand, squeezing it gently. "You didn't fail." Susan let out a breathless chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "I should have been strong enough. I should have found a way." Kyle straightened, his jaw tightening. "You did," he said firmly. "You kept us together." Susan met his gaze, her eyes filled with something unspoken, something aching. Sharon turned back to Kyle. "So? Would you go back?" Kyle felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's not that simple." Sharon's gaze didn't waver. "It is. You'd still work at the store. We'd figure out your schedule. You'd have time for Susan." Kyle exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "And the cost?" "Covered," Lawrence said smoothly. Kyle looked up, his breath catching slightly. Lawrence shrugged. "I like investments, and I think you're worth it." Kyle's fingers curled against his knees. It was too much, too big, too impossible. But before he could say anything, a familiar hand covered his own. Susan. Her grip wasn't tight, but it was steady. And when she spoke, her voice, soft but firm, held no hesitation. "Take this chance." Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes flickering between Susan and Sharon. For years, his answer would have been simple. No. No because he had responsibilities. No because it wasn't practical. No because he had never allowed himself to want something like that. But now, his grandmother, who had spent years sacrificing for him, was asking him to do this. Sharon was right. Maybe this didn't have to be his ceiling. Kyle took a deep breath. Then, slowly, cautiously, he nodded. And just like that, his world shifted again. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe. The city was awake, buzzing with life, but for the first time in years, Kyle wasn't just passing through to get to work. He had somewhere to be. His backpack sat heavy on his shoulders, the weight of new textbooks and notebooks pressing down. A strange but welcome burden. Yet despite that, his steps felt lighter. It had been years since he'd last walked onto a college campus. The last time, he had been younger, uncertain, but still full of hope. Then life had taken over. Bills, jobs, survival. But today he was here again, not just as a worker trying to make ends meet, but as a student. The first class was overwhelming. Not because the material was difficult, Kyle had always been a fast learner, but because everything felt so unfamiliar. The sound of pens scratching against paper, the glow of laptop screens, the steady murmur of classmates discussing assignments. It was all a world he had left behind. He sat near the back, trying to blend in, listening carefully to the professor's words, taking careful notes. A few seats away, a student muttered under their breath, "Man, I don't even know where to start with this." Kyle glanced over and saw the way they were frowning at the assignment sheet. Without thinking, he leaned slightly closer. "Are you stuck on something?" The student looked up, surprised. Yeah. Just, this formula isn't clicking." Kyle studied the paper, then nodded toward their notebook. "Try breaking it down like this." He quickly jotted down an example, showing the steps. The student's face lit up. "Oh, that actually makes sense now." Kyle just smiled, turning back to his own work. For the first time, the classroom didn't feel so foreign. The supermarket felt different now. It wasn't that the work had changed. The steady beeping of registers, the rustling of plastic bags, the hum of customers discussing dinner plans. But Kyle had changed. He moved through the aisles with ease, checking inventory, greeting regulars, adjusting schedules when needed. The same tasks, but with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Maria smirked when she caught him reviewing a supply order, clipboard in hand. "Not bad, boss." Jason, rolling a crate of produce onto the floor, gave him a knowing nod. "So, how's the big shot student doing?" Kyle chuckled. "Still working here, aren't I?" Jason shrugged. "Yeah, but now you've got something else too." Kyle didn't respond right away. He just scanned the order sheet one last time before setting it down. Jason was right. For the first time, he wasn't just working to survive. He was building something. One evening, after closing, Kyle locked up the store and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The night air was cool against his skin, the sky a deep navy, dotted with faint stars. He stretched his sore shoulders, rolling his neck, when a soft, familiar sound reached his ears. A quiet meow. Kyle turned and saw it. The same scrappy black and white cat that had been hanging around the store for months. It emerged from behind the crates near the alley, tail flicking lazily. Kyle smirked, shaking his head. "Knew you'd be here?" The cat trotted closer, rubbing against his ankle before sitting, its green eyes expectant. Kyle reached into his pocket, pulling out half a sandwich from his lunch. He crouched down, tearing a small piece and setting it on the ground. The cat sniffed it, then began eating, purring softly. Kyle watched for a moment, his arms resting on his knees. It was such a small thing, feeding a stray, a habit he never broke even when things were tough. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't just scraping by. He wasn't skipping meals just to make sure Susan had enough. He wasn't weighed down by the fear of what tomorrow might bring. He was still him. Still the guy who helped when he could, gave what he had. Still the guy who believed kindness mattered. Kyle tilted his head back, gazing up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible against the glow of the city lights, but they were still there, like something constant, something unchanging, even when everything else shifted. He breathed in the cool night air, feeling it settle deep in his lungs. Then, almost without thinking, almost like a quiet prayer, he murmured, "Thanks for everything." The cat gave a slow blink, as if it understood. Kyle let out a soft laugh, shaking his head before pushing himself up. Then, with lighter steps, a fuller heart, and a future that no longer felt out of reach, he walked home. Months had passed. The air had grown cooler, autumn creeping into the edges of the city. Leaves tumbled across sidewalks. The scent of warm coffee drifted from street vendors, and Kyle's days were filled with routine, but a routine that finally felt like progress. He had learned to balance school and work, juggling classes in the mornings and managing the supermarket in the evenings. It wasn't easy, but he didn't mind. Because this time, he wasn't just surviving. He was moving forward. Susan's health had remained stable. On good days, she took slow, steady walks around their apartment building, breathing in the crisp air. On even better days, she visited the store, chatting with employees, offering gentle encouragement to the younger workers. The first time she stepped inside after months of recovery, Maria rushed over to help, guiding her to a chair near the registers. "Mrs. Susan, you're looking great," she said brightly. Susan smiled, her fingers brushing over the polished counter. "I had to come see if my grandson was running things properly." Jason, overhearing, leaned against a crate of produce. "Oh, don't worry. He's bossier than Samantha ever was." Kyle, who had just walked past, raised a brow. "I heard that." Jason smirked. "Good." Susan chuckled, shaking her head. She looked proud. And Kyle felt something warm settle in his chest. Meanwhile, Sharon and Susan had rekindled their friendship as if no time had passed. Afternoons were often spent on Sharon's back porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea, reminiscing about a time when they were just two young girls dreaming about the future. Some memories made them laugh, stories of childhood mischief, old crushes, days spent sneaking extra desserts from their mothers. Others carried a softer weight, the years they had lost, the moments they wished they could have shared. "You always had the biggest dreams," Susan said one evening, stirring her tea. Sharon sighed, gazing out at her garden. "And you always kept me grounded." Susan smiled, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Maybe that's why we needed each other." Sharon turned to her, expression full of quiet understanding. "Maybe we still do." The years had taken them apart, but now they had time to make up for what they lost. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Kyle stopped by Sharon's house to check on Susan. Sharon greeted him at the door, a strange look in her eyes, something thoughtful, almost nostalgic. Without a word, she gestured for him to follow her inside. Kyle eyed her curiously, but stepped in, shaking the chill off his jacket. In the living room, Sharon pulled a small, worn notebook from a wooden box and turned to face him. "This," she said, holding it out to him, "belongs to you now." Kyle took it hesitantly, his fingers running over the cover. It was old, the edges slightly frayed, the pages filled with handwritten notes. He flipped it open, his breath catching as he recognized the handwriting. Study notes, formulas, carefully written explanations. He looked up, eyes searching Sharon's face. "Whose was this?" Sharon smiled softly. "Mine." Kyle blinked. "Yours?" She nodded. "Back when I was first starting out, I struggled. I doubted myself. But I kept this, writing things down, forcing myself to understand, pushing through even when I wanted to quit." Kyle glanced down at the faded ink. The notes were meticulous, precise. "This got me through," Sharon continued, voice gentle. "And now, I want it to do the same for you." Kyle swallowed, suddenly feeling the weight of it, not just in his hands, but in his chest. He wasn't alone in this. Someone else had stood exactly where he was standing now, doubting, struggling, pushing forward anyway. His grip on the notebook tightened. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. Sharon just nodded. "You'll do great, Kyle." And for the first time, he believed her. That night, as he walked home, Kyle tilted his head up toward the sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind city lights, but he knew they were there. A familiar meow sounded near his feet, and he chuckled, crouching down to tear off a piece of bread from his dinner. The stray cat took it eagerly, purring in contentment. Kyle sat there for a moment, watching it eat, the notebook resting beside him on the pavement. Then, looking up once more, he breathed in the cool night air and murmured, "I'm ready." And this time, he meant it. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.